afternoon, a little breeze. I think most of you might have read my first book, My Jewish Great-Grandmother, which was published 3 years ago. Both my books are memoirs. My Jewish great-grandmother recalls the pain, anguish, and growing up in post-World War II Germany. In At Home on the Road, my second book, my husband and I made history 20 years ago of coexisting for over 2 years within the confines of a 40-foot custom-built bus.
14-foot custom built.
40-foot custom-built.
Built what?
Bus.
Oh, bus.
Oh, bus.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
For those of you who do not know me, I came to live in Virginia 16 years ago. I previously lived in New York, Connecticut, Florida, England, Holland, Bermuda, France, and for a short while in Sydney, Australia. I was a stewardess for Pan American World Airways. I speak several languages: Italian, Dutch, German, French, Russian, and English. I worked as a language teacher, taught piano and organ. I was born in Germany, but I hoped to divorce my country of birth. I left in 1964 when I was 19 years old and moved first to France. I didn't speak a word of French when I moved there. To give you, let me see, I think I missed here something. Unless you already read my book, you probably wonder what prompted me to divorce my country of birth. Lies, trust, silence, cowardice, they all played a role. Although I led a protected and cloistered childhood, as a teenager I was angry to hear what Hitler had done to my family, the Jewish people, and the German nation. And I disliked the secrecy. Did the German people assume that if no one spoke about the ugly past, it would be forgotten like a bad dream? As I grew up with lies about people around me, lies about my father I'd hardly ever got to know, I lost trust in both. Love and trust complement each other. A lie destroys both. To give you a better understanding of my life during these years, I would like you to imagine being a teenager. What would your reaction be if 30 years had been erased from recent history? Imagine no one mentioning the Korean or the Vietnam Wars as if they had not taken place. Then think about that you alone heard about terrible atrocities committed by your countrymen. Events so horrible that none of your compatriots dared to mention them. Now take yourself back to an era without the internet, without social media, a time with very few televisions, when the daily news was compacted into a 20-minute segment between 8 and 8:20 at night. This was the state of affairs in Germany after World War II when I grew up. There was no mention of Hitler, the Third Reich, the war years, the extermination of Jews, the camps, the Holocaust. My school friends never spoke about them, and history class in school ended with the year 1930. But I learned about Germany's past at home. I will now read a short version of an episode from my book, the morning I first heard the term Nazi. The year is 1955. I was 10 years old. My mother and I were living in the house of my grandparents in a town called Hilden near Düsseldorf. My father had died. You will hear that I call my mother Mami and my grandparents Ama and Apa. Who is a Nazi, Mami? Mother had uttered the words in German, "Where is ein Nazi?" during breakfast one morning, Sunday morning. From the derogatory tone of her voice, I assumed she didn't like the person. Ein böser Mensch, a bad human being, Mother said, and continued her conversation with Appa, who echoed, these old Nazis. I knew better than to interrupt. Children at that time were supposed to be quiet, to listen, and not pose questions. I looked across the table at Amma for support. She must have understood my quandary because, to keep me busy, she handed me a piece of bread, which I buttered and topped with a slice of wurst. In weeks to follow, I couldn't help but wonder about the bad Nazis. Unlike children today, I didn't have access to the internet information. I didn't learn by watching television. I depended on my family, teachers, and friends for knowledge. One morning, while Mother was giving herself a manicure, I thought to inquire about what she'd said earlier one Sunday morning. Mother fussed forever over her nails, a weekly routine. I imagined it was a good time to bring up the subject. Why are the Nazis so bad? They killed many people, Mother said, and filed away at her nails. She sat in a chair near a window with a towel over her lap, ready to soak her hands in a bowl of soapy water. I had not expected that answer. I'd read creepy, adventurous stories with monsters, evil trolls, stories about conflicts and battles, never about a Nazi. Where are they? Do we know any of them? Yes, Mother said. Most of the German people are Nazis. I thought for a minute about what Mother had said. I wondered if the baker and the butcher down the street were Nazis. Could the conductor of the tram that took me to school every day be a murderer, or the policeman who directed the traffic? Many years later, when I learned how many men and women, young and old, husbands, wives, and professionals, had committed crimes against the Jewish people, I remembered what Mother had told me in 1955. Most Germans had been Nazis. But as a 10-year-old, I could not comprehend the meaning of it. Are we not Germans? Surely Amma and Appa are not Nazis. You're right, said my mother, but we are different. We have Jewish blood. I did not know about race, religion, or what it meant to be Jewish. Like most German people, we celebrated familiar in an RV these days. So my book is not a travelogue. It takes the reader on a journey to the far reaches of North America. How did it begin? In the 1990s, my husband and I were living in Miami. Ian was an executive for Airbus Industry, the European airplane manufacturer. He had previously been an airline captain flying for Pan American. And before the birth of our children, I'd been a stewardess. In Miami, I worked as a language teacher, played piano and organ in church. Our son was away at college, our daughter about to graduate from high school. Ian and I had traveled around the world, been to every continent except Antarctica. Now picture the scene. One evening, my husband had just returned from an overseas business trip. I was preparing dinner. Out of the blue, he suggested that in retirement, we would sell our house and live in an RV. My reaction, are you nuts? At that time, I never set foot inside an RV, could not imagine what they looked like. In the end, Ian convinced me, and in July of 1999, we set out on our adventure. Our vehicle, a custom-built 40-foot bus, luxuriously outfitted by the Marathon Coach factory. New, these types of vehicles are costly, 1 to 2 million apiece. Music groups and movie stars usually own them. Ours was pre-owned. Friends placed bets on how long Ian and I could endure a restricted living space. He was 64, I 54 at the time. We had no GPS, relied on the AAA American Road Atlas, and dealt with rudimentary cell phone coverage. Initially, there were countless mishaps, humorous in retrospect. The confined living space tested our marriage, and we had the inevitable disputes. What I'm now going to read to you happened a year after we started our adventure. We were heading south after having spent the summer in northern Canada and Alaska. Ian wanted to drive to Hyder. Now, probably, I would think maybe 1% of the population has ever heard of Hyder or knew where Hyder is, or probably doesn't care. But my husband wanted to drive to Hyder. It's a hamlet located northwest of Ketchikan at the end of the 75-mile fjord bordering Alaska and British Columbia. Someone had told him about bears and salmon in Hyder, as if we hadn't seen enough of them all summer long. Only one road leads to Hyder, a 4-hour round trip from Mesiadine Junction in British Columbia on the Glacier Highway. The scenery, though magnificent, was déjà vu. We had seen enough glaciers, listened to their sounds, watched them carve. Ian was more interested in dinner. I feel like having pumpkin pie for dessert. Don't we have one in the freezer? We had a 20 cubic foot refrigerator freezer, 2 doors, so we had a lot of food in there. Yes, I said, but it takes over an hour to bake. It'll be too late by the time we reach the RV park. Why don't you bake it en route? I turned on the oven, placed the pie inside, and again took my seat up front. 40 minutes later, the odor of burnt pumpkin made me hurry to the kitchen. On the rack was an empty brown pie shell, its contents on the oven walls. Oh shit, I said. I grumbled, turned off the oven and closed the door. What's the matter? Ian asked. No pumpkin pie tonight. Why? Did it ever occur to you that the frozen custard once thawed would become runny and spill during the rough ride? And it was a rough ride on that road. That's what happened, a giant mess. Ian didn't react. I put on pot holders, threw the burnt pie shell in the trash, and hoped we reached Hyder soon. Ian was lamenting his failed pie. Once the oven had cooled, I spent the remainder of the drive scraping burnt pumpkin from the oven walls. A green sign on a post alerted us that we were entering Alaska. No border control, no immigration, no customs office. The gravel road led past the U.S. Post Office, a general store, a bar, and eventually to a small campground. And as so often in the past, the bus prompted the curiosity of the locals. Who are you? What brings you here? Fewer than 100 people lived in this tiny outpost. Once again, Ian gave the story that we were scouting for a movie location. A film about bears and fish in Alaska. One fellow was quick to point out that we'd come to the right place. There was an area outside of town, he told us, where we could see more bears and salmon than anywhere in the world. Fish Creek, they called it. As we discovered the following day, the setting was surreal. Hundreds of salmon were spawning in the creek's shallow waters, their final resting place. The putrid smell of dead fish was so unbearable, I held the scarf over my nose. Several black bears, undeterred by the foul odor and oblivious to our presence, stood in the shallow water and scooped up fish to fill their stomachs. I wasn't sure if I ever wanted to eat salmon again. That day, as we prepared to leave, a fellow asked Ian when we would return. Had we seen the bears and the fish? Had we been to the local bar and enjoyed some of their powerful brew? Did we know that in Hyder there was no law enforcement because there was no crime? Ian assured the men that we would be back real soon. It was a great location for a movie. We had no desire to return. Continued south to Prince Rupert. I booked a passage on a ferry boat to Vancouver Island for the 9th of September. End of reading. For 800 years, that what people call the comfort of a home is an illusion, and that possessions are irrelevant. We discovered the uplifting spiritual beauty in nature, and as I quote from my last chapter, our home was the journey. Home was the lonely road and the highways, the rivers and valleys, the desert and the meadow with Arctic cotton. Home was the blizzard, the dispute, the blunders, the illness, the sadness, and the joy. Home was the journey few people have taken, and many should. Together we faced the challenge of the day, enjoyed the beauty of the moment, and felt the mystery of love. I've often heard people say that I led an interesting life. I recently thought about the word interesting. What does it really mean? Being a linguist, I usually think how the word translates into other languages. Oddly enough, it's very similar in the languages I know. In German, interessant, French, intéressant, in Italian, interessante, in Russian, интересное. And obviously, the word originated in Latin. Inter meaning between, est, it is from the verb to be, esse. That means interesting stands for something that is in between. In other words, out of the norm. Therefore, I would agree that my life has been interesting, out of the norm, but also exciting, challenging, sad, and full of joy. I have no regrets.